My name is Alison Roy. I am a very newly minted associate professor of history, and I am a specialist in ancient Rome, particularly, though I teach classes on Rome and Greece and mythology as well.
Yeah, and I think you've got one of the coolest areas of history, just in general, because it's there. It's so hard to study, right? Like it feels like it's a little bit of archaeology, it's a little bit of art history, and you've kind of got a good mix of stuff in there. You've recently recorded something. A give me 1 second. Let me pull up my notes. You recorded a lecture about race in the ancient world. I believe is the exact kind of verbiage that you've used. This is an interesting topic because it comes up a lot, and I think we're seeing another revitalization of this conversation. So let's start with very broadly, why is this so contentious?
Yeah. So there's been a long-standing tradition in Western societies of, of sort of seeing anything that is sort of their origin or the things that are authentic as rooted in ancient Greece and Rome, right? And it comes from ideas of empire and sort of elite education and all of those types of things. And so um, when trying to talk about race in modern contexts, the sort of the default setting of, well, for anything is to go back to Greece and Rome. What did they say? And use that as this sort of source of authenticity. And so, in discussions of race in the modern world, the classics get invoked, and they've been invoked in very unusual ways. In particular, um, in the 20th century, with the sort of rise of post colonialism and the decolonization movements, and sort of second wave feminism and the Black Power movement, there were a number of scholars who used Greece and Rome to basically make the case that you can't talk about race for Greece and Rome because they didn't have the concept of race. Race is a modern construct invented in the 19th century, and that essentially ancient peoples were colorblind. That sort of the degree of melanin had nothing to do with prejudices and sort of hierarchies of difference in the ancient world. And that was kind of the sort of standard argument. And uh, that has a lot of problems with it. And but what it did is it centered Greece and Rome in this argument. And then on the flip side, you get the fact that for the past, I would say at least 500 years, uh, the sort of dominant Western cultures have made uh, Greece and Rome increasingly white. And so, because white to them is power and is um, the sort of correct form, you could almost say. And so there's been sort of whitening of the ancient past. Like I always do this exercise with my students where I say, hey, would you close your eyes for a minute and picture for me the god Zeus? And then I asked them, how many of you pictured an old white man with a white beard? And all of them will raise their hands. And so it's a great jumping off point for discussing why do we presume this whiteness? I mean, Zeus is a god who we see across all kinds of stories could make himself look like whatever the heck he wanted to look like. So why is his authentic sort of self supposedly white? And when did he become white? So that's sort of the question I get into a lot with this. And where we've seen it crop up a lot lately is actually in film and video games. And so I don't know if you remember or watched in 2018 when Netflix did a series called Troy, Fall of a City.
I do remember that. They also did a series called Rome, right? I believe they also did
It,
Rome.
that was HBO.
That was HBO.
Yeah. So HBO Rome was in the early 2000s. I think it was 2005 or six. And then the sort of next big one, well, Spartacus was in between Stars and Spartacus, but the next big one was this Troy Fall of City. and people lost their ever-loving minds over the fact that Netflix's producers chose to cast a black actor to play Achilles. And there were all these sort of op-eds about that came out from classicists, sort of reacting to this upset, because the sort of accusation against Netflix was that they were blackwashing, that they were just for modern wokeness, essentially. Though I think 2018 was slightly pre-woke as the accusation.
I think that was like the start of because I remember growing up, or I guess that was kind of my coming of age, because you had the Gamergate stuff a little bit earlier than that. So I think we were in the pre anti-woke and sentiment. It was cropping up online. It was starting to bubble. There were some simmers going on. But, I mean, now it's something we have to deal with on a near daily basis, is these conversations about, can someone be black in a movie? And I think I've always been of the mindset of, let's just make a good movie. Like, who cares who the actor is or what the reason is? As long as it is a good and honest story, it should be fine.
Well, and personally, I think that one of the biggest issues with movies about the ancient world is that they're bad movies.
Yes. Yes.
Regardless of the casting, they're just bad movies. But so when Troy of Fall of a City came out, with these accusations of blackwashing, one of the things that sort of ways that ancient historians and classicists responded was to say, well, first off, Homer, it's a story, right? And second of all, there's a lot of evidence of people of color in Homer, and not just in Homer, but in the story of the Trojan War more broadly. The Ethiopians fight on behalf of Troy, and that's not in the Iliad itself, but is in a lot of. It's from a now lost poem, but is depicted in a lot of the art, and you see Memnon and Achilles fighting. Memnon's the king of the Ethiopians. So there's all this evidence for the existence of Black people within these spaces that had been presumed white, and so basically classicists are like, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. It's perfectly reasonable to cast a Black person to play Achilles. And I mean, this is only maybe a couple years later, the same reaction happened with Rings of Power when they cast Black actors to play elves, and people labeled it inauthentic. And I was baffled by this, because in my opinion, it's like, well, but elves aren't even real. So
yeah.
What is authentic with an elf? And why is the default setting for that white? So this is some, I think they're sociologists, but Barbara and Karen Fields wrote a book on American American racial ideas, and they coined a term called racecraft. And what they say this racecraft is essentially that a group will construct a sort of vision of the past, and they layer it with their own things that feel right to them, that feel comfortable to them. But over time, this constructed world replaces fact and becomes fact for these groups, and they are unable to see that it is not the reality, and therefore they will defend authentic versus inauthentic based on this constructed reality and not on any sort of factual basis, right? And so, essentially the idea being that Zeus is a white man with a white beard, and that's real because people have made it real over time, right? And that film and video games and other media are part of the production of this, and tend to reinforce, but also, as we can see with Troy Falls City, challenge it. So that's sort of that concept, and what's really fascinating about the whole argument is that scholars still haven't really decided how to talk about race in the ancient world, despite the fact that they get pulled into these debates. Um, and part of it is that we run into this with gender too. How do you talk about something that is an extremely modern concept when you don't even have the vocabulary for it in the society that you're talking about? So you don't even have a basis for comparison.
Right. How do you have a conversation with someone who is not only speaking a completely different language from you, but doesn't even have the concepts that you have? And I think it's really interesting because these concepts, you say they go back around 500 years, and so to protect these kind of ideas and institutions, the group you see most frequently get upset about this, I'm going to say, is typically, in my experience, anecdotally, conservative leaning pundits. They are the ones that are most likely to get upset and make a big scene about this. And I mean, that makes sense to me, right? Like, for them to be up in arms because they are trying to protect what they see as the status quo because it's a 500-year-old concept. When you actually wrap it around full circle, it's not that way. And so trying to move away from this is going to be extremely hard, and it is going to take a long time. And so what are you and other historians doing to help kind of, I guess, flesh out the classic world in a more accurate light is the word choice I'm going to use. Feel free to correct me, though.
Yeah, I mean, accurate's always a tough one because who gets to define what's accurate and what's not, right?
Sure, yeah.
And I had a professor once describe uh, our job as ancient historians as essentially, he's like, okay, so you've got a jigsaw puzzle, right? And that is our sources for the ancient world, except most of the pieces are missing. The pieces that we do have, the color's been rubbed off, so we can't see where it's supposed to fit in the puzzle, and then the box that we use as the guide to put the puzzle together is missing. And that's the monumental task that we faced in talking about the ancient world. And so more and more historians are trying to actually embrace modern concepts and modern theories to use to talk about the ancient past instead of sort of inherently rejecting them. And so you get more engagement with sort of post-colonial theory, with sort of modern gender studies and various things like that, saying, no, we shouldn't just say that because these words, these concepts didn't exist in the ancient world, that we can't use these terms to talk about them. And so but this is all, of course, talking to an academic audience, right? Academics, we mostly write for other academics, right? And we because it's part of our jobs, we're required to publish to keep our jobs. We speak to other people who have the same sort of depth of knowledge. But there's also a group of scholars who sort of rejected that model and argued that we have a sort of almost moral responsibility to be more public facing, and in order to correct very dangerous misconceptions about the ancient world that are the preserve of essentially white supremacists.
Yes, and that actually brings us into, I guess that'll bring us into ancient Rome, which has frequently been co-opted. And it's actually interesting because you've sent me some very, very fascinating articles. One of them mentions that the rise in popularity of ancient Rome among far-right conservatives, I mean, we should have seen this coming a while ago, but it is a precursor to extremely authoritarian ideals leading into fascism. And so how did that happen, and what can we do? Because I think there is an overwhelming sense that, like, I think when we talk about these things, when we talk about imagery, when we talk about, the way history gets co-opted and used for political messaging, I think it's very easy for some people to go, well, that's all just distraction, right? Like, we should be focusing on the issues. But we should be having these conversations, because if not, you are ceding the past to misinformation. So what can we do?
Yeah, and this is not a new problem. And if you think about it, the word fascism comes from the Latin word fasces, which is a bundle of sticks tied around an axe. Bundle, really, they're reeds tied around an axe, and this concoction would be carried by a group of 12 bodyguards for an elected official in Rome, and uh, that's when fascism develops. Mussolini is very consciously invoking the idea that he has created a new Rome, and he roots his authenticity in ancient Rome. And he himself is not the first to do this. That also happened in the Renaissance. The Renaissance, again, gains its authenticity from the way in which it's using ancient Rome and Greece. So not new concepts by any means. But an example that we often run into is tied again to this idea of whiteness. Besides the fact that people imagine, Julius Caesar and others to be white, we also have, since the 16th, 17th century, seen white statues as the aesthetic ideal. That the whiteness of marble, that was the way that these statues always were, and that represents the sort of height of beauty, right? It's the definition of beautiful things. And I mean, to the point where in the Renaissance, when these sort of amateur archaeologists would dig up statues, they would actually rub the existing color off them so that it wouldn't contradict their belief. Because the thing is that Rome and Greece did not leave marble statues plain white marble. They were painted. And they were painted in a way that to us is often very aesthetically displeasing. They were very vibrantly colored, lots of bright blues and reds and golds, and then also skin tones in lots of different colors. And this is broadly what we call polychromy, multiple colors. And this gets back to that racecraft idea, right? That a challenge to your version of authenticity is like an emotional upheaval, right? So they have to deface these to make it match their reality. And so one of the things that modern scholars have sought to do is really just push back against these white supremacist groups. Like probably the most famous one that does this is Identity Europa. And they use white statues, particularly Apollo Belvedere and then Michelangelo's David, which they seem to often think is an ancient statue instead of a Renaissance one. They use them on all their posters that they plaster all over, particularly college campuses, as their like,
this is where we came from.
Yeah, their calling card for their white supremacist notions, right? They saw white as perfect, therefore we see white as perfect, and there's this continuity of white power.
Yeah, the thread is that because these statues were clearly always, white, then that means the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, and everybody agrees white is just the best. And that, I mean, it's not only inaccurate, it's historical misinformation on purpose to further a political agenda, which, I mean, comes back to this point of ceding the past and pushing back against that notion. I did not know that these statues were painted. This is a piece of history that is new to me, and I think it's really, really cool. I'd like to see those statues painted. I would. I like colors. I like art. I like seeing more than just a kind of like, yeah, white statue looks neat, but like to see it as intended would be something else.
Yeah, and there, so somewhere in the 2010s, there was a traveling exhibit on polychromy. I got to see it. I can't remember if I saw it in New York or in at the Getty Museum. But basically, what it did is it took plaster casts of originals and then it used the results of um, chemical tests to determine what colors were supposed to go where, and then painted these plaster casts so that you could see what, for example, the pediment of there's a temple in to Artemis in a place called Agena that had this really vibrantly colored pediment, the sort of triangular space at the top of the roof. And so they had them displayed together, painted, so you could see, and then also had things like statues of emperors, right? Because we again think of them as just this sort of austere white, and in reality, the hair would be painted, the skin would be painted. Many of them had inlaid eyes made of ivory, so that their eyes would actually look sort of alive. And then the other thing too is the assumption that marble is the default medium, when in reality, most statues were bronze, but they don't survive because popes melted them down to make coins.
Mm.
So again, not even the medium is necessarily accurate. Like certainly there were lots of marble statues, but there were also just as many, if not more, bronze statues. And most of the most famous marble statues from ancient Rome are marble copies of Greek bronze originals.
That's fascinating. And I mean, it makes sense that in times of crisis, or when there is a major turning point, that that effort to undo and create new coins made of bronze or whatever, they would melt down those statues. And I mean, you can't melt down marble, so you either have to smash those and then you find the fragments of them, or you just kind of bury them or leave them alone, or kind of, you make that determination based on who you are at that time. And so, what has pushing back against some of these ideals look like for you personally?
I mean, I get a lot of responses like what you described of I didn't even know that they were painted. And I tend to get a lot of surprise when I point out, when I do the exercise about Zeus or Jupiter, right? Of, oh yeah, I do think about him that way. Rarely have I gotten any students who resist this. They're generally quite open to it. And what it reveals is that it's much, yes, there is a large group of white supremacists who actively pursue this agenda, but for the vast majority of popular culture's sort of misconception of the ancient world, it's due to ignorance. It's due to not having the available information, because we perpetuate certain versions of the ancient past in our storytelling that don't include these. And so, that's one of the things where a game like Assassin's Creed is both helpful and problematic, right? So Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which came out in, again, the 2010s, somewhere like 2018 maybe, and it does present a fairly polychromatic world, right? The temples are very vibrantly painted, and but they mostly reserve the painting, the color, for buildings. The extremely disproportionately large statues that they have throughout, that are just hilariously too big, in Odyssey, are almost always monochrome. They're one color. They're either bronze or they are marble. And so they almost got there, right? Because they've got the temples painted, but then they don't include the statues as well in it for the most part. Some of them do. The smaller statues are, like, there's collections of like heroic statues that you can see like when you're wandering through the game, and like Delphi and such, that are painted. But the really big ones that sort of dominate all of the posters tend to be plain white.
Interesting. And I mean, it is important to make sure that your entertainment, I guess I think there's a disingenuous argument of something like, well, Assassin's Creed is just a video game, or, well, it's just a movie, why does it matter? And it matters because that is going to be most people's first step into some of these topics. And so when you say, right, like, let's just take a Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Someone gets their Xbox for Christmas, and they get that, and they hop in and they go, wow, I really think the ancient world is really neat. I want to learn more. That will be their first step. It may have started with Assassin's Creed, but it did push them in a direction to want to learn and grow. And so that's why you have to have these conversations about those statues should probably be painted.
Yeah, and as a historian, I don't feel any need for policing a sort of strict adherence to authenticity in video games, right? They are imaginary worlds. But what I hope that they will be conscious of is not perpetuating dangerous tropes and stereotypes, or tropes that are much more modern American than they are ancient. So I have not seen the movie yet, in part because it looks utterly terrible and I don't think that I can sit through it. But Gladiator 2, I have had many students since it was first announced they were going to be making it, asking me about the movie. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a historian, an ancient historian as well, who did go and sit through it. And she's expressed supreme disappointment in Denzel Washington's character, because at first glance, casting a very well-known Black actor in a major big budget film about the ancient world seems very progressive, right? Seems like a huge step in the right direction for this argument that the ancient Rome was multicultural and that we need to be aware of that. But what they chose to actually do with the character they gave Denzel Washington was perpetuate dangerous modern tropes about Black men as essentially, violent arms dealers. And the character that he's based on is actually a very rich as in so much we could do with him, historical figure that had a much cooler story that they actually discard in order to use this really tired trope about Black men that sort of perpetuates throughout Hollywood films. And so it was almost there, and then just made it almost even worse, right? And this is one of the problems with the role that film and video games play in, as you said, being the gateway for most people's understanding of the ancient world, is if it perpetuates these modern racist tropes, then people are going to continue to assume that those modern racist tropes have their origins in the ancient world, and therefore invest them with a level of authenticity that's simply not there.
Yeah, and I think Gladiator is an interesting example, because I think a lot of people will cite, I think as we get further and further in time, you'll have more people join your class and they'll be like, oh, my first introduction was Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and you'll be like, that's great. Here, that game, it's got a lot of good in it, but here's where it's not so good. But I feel like, how often do you hear about Gladiator or Rise, Son of Rome from the Xbox? How often are those introductions for your students in your classes?
It's becoming less and less frequent that movies like Gladiator or Troy or 300 are the gateway. My students are now too young.
Oh no, I'm old.
Yeah, believe me, it hurts when they mention that it's that they I think Troy came out around 2000, 2001, something like that. So it came out before my students were born. Right, so it is old to them, right? Yeah. It's old to them in the way that the DeMille Cleopatra is old to me, and Percy Jackson remains a very common gateway, and actually increasingly the Assassin's Creed series are not as much, I find, for students taking my history classes, but my myth class. That is they get very excited to talk about them. And then I have only a few students have mentioned Rise, Son of Rome. I still get a ton of students mentioning Total War as their gateway. That's the thing that made them interested in taking a class on Rome, which I find interesting because that's a very old video game or computer game.
Yeah, I mean they've got a lot of sequels, and
They
Total
do.
War is kind of, I don't know. It's so broad, right? So you've got like Total War, Revolutions, and Total War Rome, Rome 2, and there are a ton of them. There are so many I don't want to list all of them. We'd be here forever. But I do think that's interesting. The myths aspect of it, from Assassin's Creed and stuff like that. When you have these students coming in, and they're really excited, and we're going to talk about Rome, Total War Rome now, because there is actually some misinformation in Total War Rome. I feel like I read that article and came away with that takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, there's always
A
going to be
little bit, for sure.
misinformation, for sure. I haven't played that series, so I'm actually in the beginning of September. I am doing a sort of lunchtime, sort of semi-informal lecture at the University of Idaho on ancient history and video games. And I am not much of a gamer myself, so my students always ask me, "Have you played such and such game? Have you played such and such game?" I mean, and when I teach about race, I use Assassin's Creed Origins to talk about it, and they say, "Also, have you played?" And I've always had to say, "No, I just wrote an article about it or something," and then they're so disappointed in me. And so I decided this summer I was going to have to play some of these games so that I could speak to it more directly. And so I haven't tried any of the Total War games yet, but the one of the biggest issues with Total War for me is that students, it feeds a certain type of students' desire to learn about war in a very old-fashioned political way, right? Where they just want to talk about battles, and they want to talk about the accuracy of battles. They want to talk about strategy. They want to talk about the specific types of armor that these soldiers wore, and things like that. And then my response as a teacher is, I teach war because I actually teach a class on the history of warfare. Is no, I'm going to be talking about war culturally. I'm going to be looking at why wars happen, how they're justified, and their impact on regular people. And they don't like that, right? They don't want to hear that these legions that they sort of have so much fun playing are responsible for mass rape and execution and enslavement, right? And so Total War filters the ancient world to sort of, I don't want to go as far as to say that creates incels, but like it.
Well, I mean, it labels you as the good guy, right? Like, you're the player, you're the good guy. And I think there are video games, right? Like, not all video games, but when you play a video game, you're the hero, you're the good guy. The job of the video game is to give you that escape, to make you that way. And so I think in the case of something like Total War, when you become the good guy and you're like, well, I'm just commanding my legions to go and do the thing, and then you can lay siege. So, like, I've played Total War. I'm not good at it by any means. Really bad. But you can, like, lay siege to a city, and I think that gets filtered out, right? Like, the way in which a city is impacted. And when you look at war and you want to really focus on I'm not a big war fan, pretty anti-war in general. War culturally and war as impacts and war as people are the things that are most interesting to me. Because if you're just focusing on armor and swords and I'm the hero and I'm the good guy. I think there is a real danger there that will create a level of mindset that war can be justified if you're the good guy.
And also the war is glorious, right?
And that you get honor and glory from it, yes.
Yeah. And the thing is, though, is that my responsibility as an instructor is, if I want to be a good instructor, is I can't just shut them down. I can't just say that video game is inaccurate, you're wrong, because I'll lose them I'll lose their interest, right? And then I have no room to help them grow. And so my responsibility is to instead try to work with them. And so, one of the ways I've evolved as a teacher has been, I used to be somewhat, when I started out, and this is from sort of inheriting from my own professors, a sort of dismissiveness toward film and television series and video games as the thing that brought students into the classroom, right? There'd always be this sort of eye roll of like, oh man, now I'm going to have to correct all these inaccuracies, and maintaining this sort of academic distance from pop culture. And I've just learned that that's just not a very effective means of teaching. And so I now much more embrace them, and I make the students sort of work through the problematic aspects of it. So like Total War, right? We were just talking about how it can perpetuate this idea of war as glory. Well, one of the things that's really struck me in playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey that I haven't really seen scholars talk about very much is that it seems to very consciously try to address that by making you interact with people that are experiencing a siege, right? That are stuck in the middle of this war between the Spartans and the Athenians. But one of the really strange ways in which they chose to visually portray that is to have mutilated dead bodies and like staked bodies in every single bandit camp, in the military camps. They've got these weird cults that are very much the modern definition of a cult, and in no way map onto the ancient definition of a cult. That like seem to be cannibalistic, and so again, doing the same thing as Gladiator 2, of inserting modern tropes into the ancient world as part of their sort of attempt to be progressive, and in doing so make it worse, right? Because there were not just the like mutilation happening left and right, right? I mean, there are certainly in moments of war significant violence is done, right? I will in no way downplay that, and we have written descriptions that are absolutely horrifying of the aftermath of sieges. But the implication of Assassin's Creed Odyssey is that these various people live with these dead bodies as like weird trophies, and and that they're perpetuating this idea of like the sort of sadistic thrill of mutilating a body, which I just don't see a lot of evidence of in the ancient world as being nearly as commonplace as the Assassin's Creed series makes it out to be. So again, modern tropes being inserted in, but made to seem as if they're authentic, ancient things.
Yeah, and I think that comes from the video gameification of needing a bad guy, right? Like, you need some easy way. There's not a whole lot of room for nuance in your video games. If there's a lot of nuance, there are games that have done it in incredible ways, but those games are far and few between. But you need a bad guy, and you need a clear-cut bad guy for most players. And to be walking through your city and you're just like, oh, people are staked up on spikes, or here's a cannibalistic cult. Bad guys. It's time to do the action stuff. And so, where do you start how do you reach out when you're reaching out to some of these students, specifically with some of the Total War stuff? So how do you push back on some of those ideas and kind of get them to come a little bit closer to where you are? And so you go and you meet them and you bring them a little closer. What does that look like for you?
Usually my first step is to penetrate the sort of bubble of great military leaders being good people. And so, which is not to say that I'm arguing that great military leaders are inherently bad people, but simply that they are complex human figures and that we can't ascribe them, wholly positive or wholly negative traits, right? So Julius Caesar is a common example here, right? Oh, he's the great general, and he was gonna, like, the world would be so different if he'd survived and not been assassinated and everything. And so usually I use the Socratic method. So I say, well, okay, you're talking about the siege of Alesia, for example, and how fun it is to sort of play this siege, right? It's an incredible engineering feat of doing the circumvallation, of building a secondary wall around the city to cage them in, and everything. And I say, okay, how do the women and children that are in that besieged city feel about Julius Caesar? How about the women and children who are sent out by Vercingetorix in the hopes that the Rome, because they're starving to death, and he's hoping that the Romans will let them pass through because they are innocents, and instead Caesar lets them starve to death or kills them in the no man's land between the two walls? How did they feel about Caesar? Did they see him as a great general, as someone, and doing it that way of sort of trying to get them to think about the other side's perspective, right? And that definitions of greatness are always defined by the victors, right? And we have that phrase so commonly, right? Of history is written by the victors, but it's become, like just such a throwaway phrase that we don't really think about what it actually means in practice. So that tends to be where I start. And sometimes with the counterfactual questions like, oh, the world would be so different if he'd survived. So I say, okay, well, play it out for me. What would have happened? Here's what we know about the legislation he was doing in the moments before his, in the lead up to his death. So if this type of stuff, if the sources portray it to us accurately, how would the world have been different? And typically they can't make it that different, right? It leads, if not to a similar monarchical system, to civil war again, and which is what does happen even when he is killed, right? That there's no like magical fix if someone's lived, right? Or someone, another one I get asked a lot is, if Alexander the Great had been more interested in marching west instead of east, what would the world look like? And and my response is typically, well, that would never have happened, because to the Hellenistic Greeks, Rome was not even a blip on their radar. And so it would not have even occurred to them. Why would they go to what they see as a cultural backwater when they could go and steal all the riches from Persia, right? It's the Romans who later they insert themselves into the Alexander story, hoping to make themselves sound cooler because they know that they're the babies in this sort of cultural sort of progression, right? The timeline, because yes, they exist at the time, but they aren't a world power yet.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned on the history is written by the victors, but you really do need to take the perspective of the losers to get a more fleshed out picture. If you're only getting your history from the winners, I think you're probably getting propaganda, is more than likely what you are receiving. And so you really need, when you talk about the siege and Vercingetorix, they are undeniably in a worse spot, but it does showcase, Caesar and his troops as not willing to compromise here. It shows a very fundamental, right, like almost genocidal view of Caesar, that if you come right up to it and you're looking at this from, if you're inside the city, you're like, these are the worst people in the world and they're slaughtering women and children. Like, kill me and my soldiers, fine, but not the women. That's genocide, right? Like, I think from the loser's perspective, you watch your wives and sons and daughters march out and they get executed and you go, oh, genocide, excellent, right? Like, that's, I think, to get a better picture, you need that mosaic.
And I think that's one thing historians are. That's one thing that's changed. That they are more willing to do now is to unapologetically label it genocide. So it used to be much more common to apologize in a way, essentially like, oh well, genocide's a modern concept. How do we measure it? But they didn't have the concept of genocide, so we can't really then apply to them because that'd be anachronistic. Most historians now say, no, Caesar committed genocide. The estimates for the population of Gaul before his invasion was around 3 million people, and 1 million of those people die in his 10-year campaign.
And
That's a third of the population.
Yeah, and one thing I think we should all be very aware of is genocide is different from a concept like race or gender. Like, let's set aside some modern concepts. His goal there was to still conquer territory, eliminate the culture, and assimilate them into the Roman Empire. Those are all the ingredients I think you need to be able to label something right. Like, at least if you're not willing to go all the way to genocide, call it what it is. It's an ethnic cleansing, right? Like,
though I do, I always make people clarify what they mean by assimilation, because the Romans are not an empire that's like the British were, of setting out to make people Roman. The Roman Empire is more the type, because there's usually sort of two broad types of empires. One that sets out to make the people they conquer like them, and the other that becomes more like the people they conquer because they're much more interested in taking it economically and for resource extraction, and they leave the local governments in place. And over time, therefore, there's a lot of sort of cultural interaction and such. So that tends to be the Romans. Assimilate in terms of make them part of the Roman Empire and have to pay taxes and subject to Roman laws. Absolutely, that is very much what they were doing. And where people have in the past tried to really sort of try to avoid having to use the word genocide is more of a Geneva Convention definition of it, of, as you said, the ethnic cleansing component of it. And then they'll say, oh, well, there's not any evidence that that's what they were trying to do. And it's like, yeah, well, tell that to the Druids, in Caesar's own words, right? And then the other thing, too, going back to Alesia, that games like Total War sort of erase, is he almost lost. And not only did he almost lost, but he came very close himself to being killed at one of the attempts to breach the wall. So that, and essentially it's actually, I think it's Libanius who saves his life. And Libanius is one of his better lieutenants, and actually is one of the ones who sides against Caesar when Caesar marches crosses the Rubicon. So he goes from saving Caesar's life to being an outlaw in Caesar's mind, and ultimately pays the price with his life. But it was essentially luck. And same with Alexander the Great. So many of his battles, his victories were incredibly close fought battles and came down to luck as much as anything. But that gets sort of
flattened.
Yeah, to focus on their strategic genius, right? And a game that asks you to use military strategy to win the game is going to, of course, exaggerate that skill aspect of any person's historical figure's personality.
And I think we can wrap this all back around to our modern day alt-right and why they have such a fascination with the ancient world. These are flat caricatures that are strong men that, in their minds, are white great leaders, and they are infallible. And the world would be better if they weren't assassinated. That's their dictator. That's their perfect dictator. That's the guy they want. And so, why do you see this co-opting of history, specifically the ancient world and ancient architecture and all this really interesting history get flattened and kind of pasted for these alt-right groups, it's because they haven't needed to come up and conflict, and they can flatten it down and say, weren't things better then? Like, look at how awesome they were. They were unstoppable. And I think it's just very easy for them to co-opt someone who they've already been flattened, right?
Exactly, right? They're co-opting a fake version.
Yeah.
Right? They're not co-opting a real version. But the thing that gives them the feeling of justification in what they do is that what they are building off of is generations of this process, right?
I lost my camera. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, it's generations of this process going back, really probably to at least the Renaissance of seeing, of sort of Northwestern Europe seeing their own right to rule as directly tied to them being the heirs of Rome. And to the extent that in I think it was in 1999. So, there's been this back and forth about the Elgin marbles, right? Which is the parts of the Parthenon frieze that Lord Elgin stole, just chiseled right off the Parthenon in the 19th century. And there's been this, 100 plus years of back and forth between Athens and London over whether or not the British will give back the Elgin marbles. And in 1999, there was an article published in the Telegraph in which essentially the journalist basically says that the British are more ancient Greek than actual Greeks are, and therefore they more deserve the Elgin marbles than the Greeks do. So what is said is modern Greeks are no relation whatever to the ancient Athenians. The modern Greek is short and swarthy, descended from generations of Turkish occupiers, whereas the ancient Athenian was fair and long-limbed. The presence of the Elgin marbles would serve as an even more hurtful daily reminder, meaning giving it back to them would make them sad, because it would make them realize how much they're not like the Athenians, who were tall and fair-skinned and very British, right? And in another one, same year, said, any suspicion that modern Greeks are the heirs of Cleon, who's a very famous Athenian demagogue, will be dispelled by their petulance about the marbles, right? That them being upset about it is proof that they aren't true heirs, right? And so this is this complete reworking of ancient Greece as more properly belonging to the British than to people who actually live in Greece and are generationally Greek, right? Because the British are in power, the British are white, the Athenians are white, therefore they are the more justified owners of this cultural heritage. And so that's been happening for generations. And so, white nationalists don't have to work very hard to find fodder for this argument of theirs, right? It's perpetuated in the way in which we've studied Greece and Rome for generations.
Yeah, and so I don't want anyone to feel hopeless, so what can we do in this instance? What are the best ways to push back against these harmful, these harmful stereotypes of the ancient world?
I mean, I think confronting them with the complexity of what the ancient world actually is, show them the evidence for polychromy, show them what these would have looked like, these things, the word so Homer uses little epithets as that he gives to each individual character as a way to make the meter work effectively. And the one for Odysseus translates to dark skinned. And modern translators almost always translate that as tanned or ruddy, or things like that, so that they don't have to confront what that might have actually meant, because we don't know what dark meant to ancient Greeks, right? We don't know what red or blue or any color meant to them, because their culture, those are all culturally constructed things, and they're different than ours. So I think just pointing that out, showing examples of that, flipping things around and asking them, using the Socratic method on them to get them to notice the flaws in their own thinking. But, I don't know how much we're going to reach hardcore white supremacists, because as you sort of started with, in this day and age, they're so deeply entrenched in misinformation that it's very hard to, the arguments don't work, right? So my hope is always in addressing the people who just don't know that this information's out there, right? Who are genuinely interested in the ancient world and just didn't know, like you didn't know, that these statues were painted. And the more that we can present a pop culture version of the ancient world that is more nuanced, the more we're going to stop broadly as a culture perpetuating these stories, and that will make the screaming voices of white nationalists quieter and quieter, right? They won't get traction. That's my hope, ultimately.
And I think that's a great place to stop. I think that's think about the media that you're consuming. Consume this podcast. It is helpful. This is a learning show. Alison, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any final closing thoughts? Where can more people find you if they've liked what they've heard today?
Well, I would say I'm probably not me necessarily, because I am, in the grand scheme of academics, still a baby academic. I don't have a lot of publications. But I always recommend Sarah Bond, who's the historian who wrote the hyperallergic articles I sent you. She is doing saintly work out there. She has a Forbes, or I don't know if she still has it, but she had a Forbes column. She's positioned herself very much as the person arguing back against these red pill societies and alt-right groups. And I think that it's a really great thing we can do for her to keep her motivated to keep doing this, is to read her work. I would also say Donna Zuckerberg, who happens to be Mark Zuckerberg's sibling, has a classics degree. And she wrote a book called Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age, which is very much about these red pill societies and online alt-right groups and the ways in which they co-opt the ancient world. That's a great one. And then I assigned a book to my myth class called Antiquity Rising, on the subversive power of myths, which is ultimately quite depressing in some ways. It's about all the ways in which women are trampled upon in myth, and how that helps to perpetuate modern patriarchal stereotypes. But the more that we can shine a light on the work of historians who are trying to be out there and be public facing and do this stuff, I think the more we can help them be successful in this process. I'll just take a class if you're ever interested and you like a video game, you want to know more about it. Take a class, read a book by an academic. Fact check for yourself. Don't rely on the internet, because my goodness, is there a lot of incorrect information out there.
Especially about the ancient world, for sure.
Oh my goodness.
Especially about the ancient world. Do not go to Reddit. You will not be helped.
No.
Alison, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it, and we'll have you back on the show.